Hello and welcome. In the last section, we actually built up the bare bones card component and essentially made it available on the layer bar. Okay, and before we go any further on the card component, I want to take a quick segue into cross-origin request sharing concept, something that's also known as CORS. Okay, we briefly touched upon this in our design of the browse component or the catalog component, but we kind of glossed over some of the details over there. In my opinion, it's important to understand some of the details here as we build our distributed application, and it's one of the core components of distributed design and application development. So with that said, let's head over to one of the diagrams here and that we've been referring to all along. So if you look closely here, we have Netlify running our React app frontend, and that has a different domain here. And we have Heroku running our Node.js backend API infrastructure, okay? And that's going to be running on a different domain. So the idea, of course, is that we actually have a mutual trust between two collaborating domains, right? And which is essentially a very common thing in when you develop distributed full stack applications. Okay, and we also have a similar kind of setup here between MongoDB and Heroku, where we need to have that trust built in to MongoDB to accept connections only from the Heroku backend. Okay, so how do we do that in reality in when implementing this in the code base? We have already done that, but we will go back and revisit in terms of the better way of essentially doing that. Okay, so let's head over to our code base, and in here I will go to the API_IndexCafe project, and if you look at it in the index.js page, we already have stuff wired in as far as CORS is concerned. So in here I'm setting a few headers for the access control origin, and right now it's set to a wildcard, which means anybody from any domain can connect to our backend API infrastructure. Okay, and I'm also setting other headers in terms of what methods are being allowed and what headers, which are essentially custom headers. This is not necessarily needed. This is kind of right now because we're not using the custom headers in our invocation of the APIs from the front end. Okay, super. So right now, if I go ahead and essentially execute any of our APIs, I should be getting a request or a response or something like this. Okay, and let me go ahead and get the categories in here. I should be getting the request like so. All right, you see all these headers which are injected by our code in here. Okay, right here. And you could also see a similar thing if we execute this from our UI. So let's go over here and inspect the network tab. And if I go to the browse or the dish catalog component, I should be able to see the response and the headers here as well. Right now it's saying cancelled because alright, so right now we are connecting to the APIs that are deployed on Heroku, and right now it says it's cancelled for some reason. Probably it's timed out in my opinion, so that's something that we need to look at as well. So let's see, why did it time out? Maybe the console will have that. Yeah, it has timed out because we have set a timeline of 5,000 milliseconds. Maybe we can increase it because the first time around it would be there would be a kind of a response lag, so we should probably set it to 10,000. Let's go ahead and do that quickly. I'll head over to my FE_IndexCafe project, and inside here I'm going to set the timeout to 10,000. Okay, generally it shouldn't be so much, but the first request will always take more time because of the ramp up time and all that stuff. Plus we're also working on a free tier of the deployment infrastructure, right? Super. So with that in place, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to head over to my code base in here. I'll also make another change in FE_IndexCafe, and I'm going to say I don't want to go over to my Heroku for now. I will go ahead and say I want to access the local version of my APIs, which are running locally on my setup. Okay, So with this in place, what I have to do now is I have to bounce the server again because I made the changes in here. They don't necessarily hot reload that change. So I'm going to say npm start super, and hopefully that should give us another tab here, which means I'm going to go ahead and close this. Alright, so here we are. So next I'm going to essentially open my inspection tabs, and especially the network ones, okay, because that's where I need to look at for the details in here. So I'm going to go ahead and say browse, okay, and in here I'm seeing all those cross-origin requests, right? So if I go in here, let's take one of these, maybe the categories. So you see all these headers in here, and those are making the communication between our React UI and the API server possible. Without these headers, the browser would essentially reject these cross-origin communication altogether. Okay, super. So the next thing we want to do here is I want to show a couple of things, and one of those things is the other way of doing that. And while we actually did that while we were actually essentially doing this work, we installed our a framework, or rather a library, npm library, and that was called CORS, right? And which essentially does the same thing that we are doing here right now. Okay. And another question that you might have in your mind is that when we essentially did this particular thing from the REST client, the request still did go through fine. And the question you might be having is, how come that worked here and it won't work in a browser? We'll come to that in a bit. So let's first go over to the package.json in here, and you can see that we already have CORS deployed here. Okay, so what I'm going to do here right now, let me go ahead and close this. I'm going to head over to index.js. And in here, I'm going to remove this particular bit of code because essentially you can accomplish the same thing in a shorter way. All right. So I'm going to say app.use. All right. And I think we already have CORS in here. I think we have required CORS already. Yeah, we do have CORS. So I'm going to say let's use CORS. Okay. And let's see what it does right now. What I'm going to do here is head over back to my UI and re-execute this particular operation. Go over to the dish catalog, and in here I should be able to see the same request going back and forth again, right? So we get the same thing, same response back, and then with the same set of headers, right? So there is no change, right? Even though we actually went ahead and changed the settings here, essentially does the same thing, right? But with lesser lines of code. Okay. Now let's do an interesting thing here. Let's head over to the browser, and I'm going to essentially go into google.com, and in here I'm going to look for npm CORS. Okay. And inside of here, I'm going to look at some of the details in terms of the usage and the options actually provided by this particular library, right? And in here you can configure CORS in different ways, and one of the options that you can provide here is the origin, and you can give this origin to when essentially configuring CORS, just like here, right? So what that means here is that with this restriction in place, we can access REST from a particular origin only, right? And let's see how we can actually go ahead and implement this, right? I'll head over back to my code editor, back into API_indie cafe, and inside of here, what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to define a new variable, and that's called CORS options, and this is going to be an object, all right? And inside of here, I'm going to define a origin property. All right, and this would have an origin. Let's call it localhost 3000, because that's where we're running right now. And I'm going to supply this to the CORS component here, and like so. So right now we are restricting our CORS policy to allow communication only from this particular domain, okay? And that's where we are running right now. And if I go back in here and re-execute my API calls, let me clear this, go back here and come back in. We still see that our APIs are running just fine, okay? And we see that, you know, our server, API server, is sending these access allow origin headers with localhost 3000, and the browser sees that, you know, we are good to go, and essentially allows us to view all these components and the dishes and the categories, okay? So the view is rendered for us. And now if I go back to our API code one more time, and I'm going to go ahead and change this. Let me go ahead and change this, and hopefully that has essentially restarted here. Yeah, it's connected to Mongo, and I'll head over back to my UI and in here and clear the console, come back in, and this time around we get a CORS error, and let's see what the error is. The error says it's CORS error in here, but if you go back to the console, it gives you a much clearer error, because I think we're logging this error right now, and it says we are calling from a different origin, and the supported origin is different, right? So origin is actually a combination of the scheme, which is HTTP or HTTPS, the host name, and the port. They together constitute a unique origin name. So even if the port differs, they are treated as different origins, okay? So let's head over back to the code and then change that. So if I go in here right now, go over and then make a change, it should be able to work. So instead of doing this way, what I'm going to do here is I'll head over to my .env and essentially define a new key for CORS underscore origin, okay? And that's going to contain HTTP localhost 3000, yeah, 3000. And I'm going to essentially go in here to index.js, and instead of hard coding this value, I'm going to say I want it to be process.env and call CORS origin, okay? So let's see if this actually works fine now. I think this actually bounced. So after this change, let's see if we actually get a favorable response from a browser, okay? Let's see, it's spinning super. I think we got a favorable response this time, so which means we are looking good here, okay? So our CORS setting is looking good right now. So let's go ahead and actually do this change on our server. So before we actually go ahead and make that change, I would like to answer the question where, you know, we said if we have CORS restrictions in here, not in AFI, it's going to be an API. Why is it that, you know, the REST client is able to get the response back, even though we're not setting any headers here in terms of the origin, right? So the reason for that, so the whole thing works in the concept of origin. So if I go back in here, and look at one of the requests here, and let's say I go to the request headers, and in here we have the origin set, right? So yeah, the origin is set, okay? And this is what is being used by the backend server, right, to determine that, you know, whether a particular person, essentially the backend server sets these headers in terms of what's allowed, and in here it says origin allowed us this, and the browser sees to it that, you know, this is something that, you know, okay, and that it's not allowed. Okay, interesting. We are running in 3000, and then this one says access control allow headers is star, allow origin is this one. This is not right actually, because we are running on 3000. This should have actually failed. I think something is incorrect. So maybe we forgot to bounce the server, because apparently what could be happening is it is not picking up our change, right? So let's head over to API_indicaf, okay, and essentially close this down, terminate this, and I'm going to say npm.dev again. I'm quite certain it's not picked up that change. In fact, what I'm going to do here is console log in this particular variable. Console log, and you want to say process.env, and that's going to be CORS origin. Okay, super. So I think that's how we renamed it, by the way. CORS underscore origin. Okay, all right. So now this is connected. Let's head over back to the UI. I'll go back to the landing page. Do a hard reset here. Hard refresh. Let me close this and go back over here. And here this is pending. And I expect this to now have it. Yeah, there we go. The access control origin is 3000. I'm not sure why, even though it was 3001, and the browser was still showing that up. I'm still a little puzzled actually. Okay, and allow headers is also star, even though, so essentially it's giving us the same set of headers that we were earlier setting through the middleware, but now we've condensed the code by using the CORS library. Okay, so if I go back in here now, I should be able to see that particular log statement, right? Log statement somewhere. I wish I could search here. We have way too many logs right now because of, let's say, Morgan. What I'm going to do here, let me go ahead and stop Morgan for a moment, and I want to essentially, yeah, it's here, it's right here. Okay, so it's actually printing that stuff here. All right, so which means that it's picking up the latest code here. Let me go over and essentially uncomment the Morgan code. Okay, so I think we can essentially try to mimic the same behavior on our server. I think this video has gone a little longer than we anticipated. What we'll do is we'll take a brief pause, come back and start a new session, and where we'll actually push this code to our GitHub, and then from there we'll actually do a continuous deployment to integration and deployment to the Heroku app again. Okay, let's take a brief pause, come back soon.